So we ended last week with this idea. It's a general question about Beit Hanan, about the parsha we just read in Shabbos. He mentions Vanesha Bagai Mul Bet Peor a few times.
Mm-hmm.
Why does he keep mentioning this? We're sitting in front of the house of Peor, the most disgusting type of avodah zarah. Why mention so? So the usual explanation is that he's giving them tochicha. He's rebuking them. But the Alter Rebbe says that there's much more to it, because we said that for Moshe Rabbeinu to be able to be mechadesh, to say new words of Torah without first being told by Hashem, that requires a tremendous amount of bittul. And this is the basic idea, right? That any kind of new Torah that can come out depends on the level of nullification of the individual. So this is an almost counterintuitive conclusion. Usually people think that Torah is here to chase away the darkness. Meaning that Hashem revealed to us what we need to do in order for us to be able to cope with the uncertainty of life. So we don't know what we're supposed to do. No person really knows what they're supposed to do with their lives. We just sort of do things. And here Hashem gave us a recipe for how to live life. That's what the Torah is to reveal the unknown. And before there was Torah, how did Avram know that there was Hashem? How did Avram?
He worked it out.
He worked it out. But how did he know? He didn't know. He only worked it out, like you said. So from his point of view, that's what he thinks. That's what he believes in. But until the revelation of Hashem at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai, there was no certainty. There was no clear indication that this is what is true. Meaning, you could believe Avraham, which is very nice. He's a good guy. You can believe him. But there's a few other guys running around the world saying, Hashem revealed himself to me, and I have the right recipe for life. If you were in some empire like Avram was, Nimrod's empire, so Nimrod was the master of the revelation, if you want. He was the master of certainty. He told you how life was supposed to be lived. He told you what it meant to be alive. And when Avram didn't want to conform, so he threw him into the fiery furnace. And he said, okay, let's see. If you're right, then in my trial by fire, you will survive. Because apparently you have a better connection to the infinite, to the divine. And if I'm right, you'll burn, because I decide, I get to call the shots. Kind of unfair, because he's using nature on his side. But what could Avram do? That was the option.
It was interesting that when Avram succeeded in the test, that Nimrod did resign and give over the kingship to Avram.
Right. Because naturally that's what should have happened. But Nimrod was no fool. He must have rigged it in such a way that Avram could maybe come out, but nobody would believe that it's Avram or anything like that. I don't know. Meaning he was sure, he made certain that his people wouldn't believe from now on that Avram knows more than he does. I don't know what he did, but he must have done something, because he wasn't about to lose his reign because of some 40-year-old who's telling a guy who wants to be a Jew all the more. He wasn't about to lose it for that. So he had to devise something. I don't know what he did exactly. But you're right, it's very surprising that Avram didn't take over the whole Nimrodian empire, whatever that was at the time. So again, the normal way of thinking about Torah is the Torah comes to give me certainty. It comes to tell me how to, if not how to live this life. Maybe there's some people who don't think that it helps with this life. I think that's wrong. It's completely not the point. It is about this life. But some people think that it's talking about how you get into heaven. This is the recipe for getting into heaven. As if, and sometimes you hear these stupid comments. Yeah, right. Nobody's ever come back to tell us whether it worked or not. So why would you follow this? And then you have this nonsense called Pascal's wager, which is Pascal was a very theologically educated man. He was going to be a priest before he became Pascal, right? So he had this idea that I want to get into heaven. I don't know what heaven is and if this will really bring me there. But since it doesn't really take away that much from my life, I'll take the wager that maybe, right, this is like filling out the lottery and thinking that I'll win big. And so it's worth it, he said, because it's only, I don't know, $2 to play the lottery. Maybe I'll win big. We know today that that's kind of foolish, right? Because lotteries were made to take money away from poor people and to give it maybe to other poor people. But anybody who's rich doesn't play the lottery because they think it's a waste of money because my chances of winning are so small. In Pascal's wager, the chances of winning are minuscule because you don't even know what the chances are. You can't even calculate them. So I don't know what he based his wager on. But the other side of it is that, no, Torah is about giving me certainty in this life. I don't know what will happen afterwards. I don't know who's Ben Olam Haba. I don't even know what that is exactly. But I see that my life in this world is more meaningful and better when I connect to Hashem, when I follow the Torah. So it becomes that the Torah is about this world. It's not about the world to come. And here, so you got this overriding feeling and experience that Torah is about certainty. It's about giving you a sense of certainty and clarity. So it's very understandable that people are against innovation in Torah, because anything that's certain, why would you upend it? Why would you weaken it by adding more layers that haven't been tried and tested, right? So if you come about and you say, I want to start some new minhag or something, or I have this new chiddush in Torah, so the first question they ask you is, does this change halacha? If it doesn't change halacha, think whatever you want. We don't care. But if you came and you changed halacha, now you're in trouble. Why are you in trouble?
They did care about Shem Tov.
What?
They did care about Shem Tov.
Right, because
And the Baal Shem Tov didn't change halacha.
he did
What did he change?
many things. Any minhag that he started that was different than what had been done until then was considered to be an affront to the certainty provided by Torah. I mean, that's a Haredi mindset.
He already changed the value of the poor people in the eyes of
No. He changed things that were very ingrained into Jewish life. He changed it, and he changed it in the name of the Torah. So that even if he didn't change halacha, not to mention that they did change. What's the thing that Chabad is attacked for more than anything else? The sukkah. I thought you were going to say the sukkah.
No, I didn't know what you
The
said.
thing that Chabad is attacked more than for anything else. It's the sukkah. Davening late and the sukkah. Why those two things? Because there's a changing halacha. Who gave you the permission to change halacha? This is our bastion against uncertainty in the world. And you come and you weaken it. Because you say you can do this. Don't you see, even though you say, well, it's not such a big deal. Sukkah is a big deal. Davening late is like shaky. Because there are opinions. Sukkah is very hard to, whatever. So don't you see that you're opening the road to Reform Judaism? Don't you see that you're undermining all our efforts for 3,300 years? And it's a good argument. It's very hard to answer against it. So the answer really is, well, look at the rest of the world of Chabad observance. It's the opposite. It's more strict than everybody else. So you can't say that we're undermining. Say, no, it's not. The problem isn't about you. I know you'll be okay. You'll stay. But you're undermining us because you're opening an opening for people who don't understand to come and say, well, I can change halacha when I want to. And that's a very serious threat.
Big deal.
It is. It's not something you can just frown on and just say, forget about it. Now, how is this different than a minhag? So somebody has this minhag and somebody has that minhag. Usually people don't argue about it because we know that it's a minhag. So I don't know. I haven't seen. I think that this is. I don't want to get into it. It's not the topic. I'm just saying that that's how you perceive Torah in the first place. The Torah is supposed to give you certainty, and here he says something amazing. He says that when you want to have new Torah insight, new insight into Torah, you have to have nullification. What does nullification mean? So you say nullification means I'm very, very devoted to God. That's not what he says here exactly. It's not the explanation. Bittul doesn't mean nullifying yourself to God in the sense of just what we call clinging to God. That is the opposite of the peor. So it's not clinging. Okay? There's clinging to peor, and there's clinging to God. And he says here that peor here is not what I thought it was. I thought he was talking about the Avodah Zarah. And he's telling me, no, the peor is a signpost for how you need to be, in a certain sense, with Hashem. You have to be. This is what protects you when you're with Hashem. Bittul really means being able to empty yourself. That's what it means. Bittul really means to nullify yourself. To nullify yourself means to empty your thoughts. So you don't do it all the time. That's not how we learn Torah. We're not Buddhists. Buddhists all the time, they just want to be empty. We're not like that at all. But
that's another one of the things I know nothing about.
Okay, that doesn't matter. But that's what they do all day. They empty the mind.
Yeah.
That's the basic practice there.
Modus vivendus.
Right. But by a Jew, that's not true. We fill the mind all the time. We're learning constantly. Anybody says, yeah, you can do Eastern meditation, and it's just like Judaism. Unfortunately, there was somebody in the last generation who was a very, he became a very famous rabbi. Also because he died when he was very young. He was 48 or 49, doesn't matter who. And he wrote books where he compared Kabbalistic meditation to Eastern meditation. It's a terrible thing. He was trying to tell all the Jubus in California in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, look, you can pursue the same stuff that you're turned on by from Eastern meditation, you can pursue it through Torah. I don't know how many people actually bought it. I don't think it turned anybody away from that. But what it did do was it created a generation of very spiritually minded young Jews who were born in the 70s and 80s and 90s, who today think that Jewish meditation is the same thing as Eastern meditation, and that our purpose is to empty the mind. But that's completely the opposite from Yiddishkeit. And it doesn't matter whether you study Yiddishkeit at Telz Yeshiva, or you study it in Ponevizh, or you study it in Tomchi Tmimim, or you study it anywhere. In any base medrash in the world, you don't empty your mind. Nobody sits there and empties their mind. On the contrary, it's exactly the opposite. You fill your mind. What do you fill your mind with? With the understanding of the sages. You learn Gemara, you learn Halacha, but you're learning all the time. You're filling your mind with thoughts. You're not emptying your mind from thoughts. And these are very complex thoughts. There are thoughts that are complex enough that the greatest minds in the world can spend their entire lives dedicated to understanding this complex thought called the Talmud.
Just look at Yom Yom.
Okay.
An empty mind just attracts
Tumah. So it's not about that. And why this rabbi wrote that was very misguided. It's a very, very big mistake. I mean, really
Why did you
misguided.
talk to him?
Because he died before I read his stuff. And why would I talk to him? Why would he even listen to me?
That's a very poor excuse.
But why didn't the people who knew what he was writing and knew better, why didn't they talk to him? The reason is, the strange thing is, the real reason, okay, that's not a reason. that's the wrong people to send to him. The right people to send to him would be somebody like Rav Ginsburg, who knew all the Kabbalah that he wrote about, and could tell him this is not what it means, and you know it's not what it means. Read it. It's right in front of you.
Where was Rabbi Ginsburg?
He didn't know about this. He only found out about this in the 90s after this man had passed away. And so anybody who's interested, he's not in the habit of usually criticizing culture or books or anything like that, so you don't really hear anything like this from him. But once in a while he does say this, and he says this is one of the most ridiculous books I've ever seen. It's just so misleading. It's got nothing to do with anything. And how the truth is, he's so surprised and shocked by it that he couldn't believe that anybody fell for it. Exactly. He couldn't believe that anybody who had spent a moment in the yeshiva would think that this was the correct interpretation of these Kabbalistic texts. But now there's a caveat. And the caveat is, I think, what the Rebbe is saying here. The caveat is that bittul does mean, at some level, nullifying yourself. Nullifying yourself does mean not just commitment to something, not just that I'm committed to you, but that I also remove my thoughts and I take on yours. So he says, in order to learn Talmud well, you can't come to the Talmud saying, what do I think about this topic? It's not that that's not an important question, but you can't come that way. You can't really ask that question in the beginning. There's a way of learning, by the way, of understanding Talmud, which is very popular in the national Zionist world. Like it was popularized by two rabbis who are very big scholars. And they used to ask their Talmidim at the beginning of the Shir, what would we have said if the Talmud wouldn't have said anything about this? That's how they started the discussion. So they challenged the students to first think about how they would have understood this pasuk. Okay? Now, the only reason that this flew in the yeshiva that they taught was that after they discussed for a few minutes what the students would have thought, they immediately usually discounted all of it and said, and look here now we'll turn to see what the Torah says. So it's okay, you have opinions, it's very nice, but we're learning Torah here, we're not interested in your opinion. Is it a good strategy? I don't know.
Somebody pressed the golden button to win the Willy Wonka golden ticket, for a free bar of chocolate.
So suddenly you have here a person who knows what the Talmud thinks, and he's a genius. And that's a big question. Does he become a genius in his own right? Or do people understand that he's just following in the footsteps of giants? It's a big question. It could be a very tremendous test to the ego, that the person suddenly has a very inflated ego because of that. I'm saying that's not I don't think, maybe to engage the students it's a way to start, but you can't teach this way in the long term. You have to teach a person to have nullification before what the Talmud says. But to do that, nullification means that you have to remove your preconceptions. So there is such a thing as removing your understanding. Because you can't really understand what the Torah is saying until you remove your preconceptions. If you come to the Torah saying, I know all about capital punishment, because I'm a doctor, I'm a PhD in law, and I know all there is to know about capital punishment. Okay, let's see what the Torah has to say. And then you do this comparative textual criticism. You're not going to get very far. in either sense. You're not going to get very far in the intellectual sense. You're certainly not going to get very far in the spiritual sense. So you have to have this nullification, which really means that you have to be willing to be a vessel. Okay? Rabbi El just passed away. Once he was asked, many times he was asked, what's the secret to your being able to remember almost verbatim 5 hours worth of the Rebbe's talks on Shabbos and then write it out? How can you do that? It's like superhuman memory. And I don't think he had a superhuman memory. He had a very good memory, but I don't think he had superhuman memory. And so his answer invariably was, because when I listen to the Rebbe, I'm only listening to the Rebbe. I'm not trying to process. I'm not trying to think, what do I think about this? I'm just there. All I'm doing is listening to the Rebbe. And when you listen that way, this is known. This is how, right, Shari Yichud, by the Middler Rebbe, that's what Chochmah is. Chochmah is the ability on the part of the listener to be completely nullified before the speaker. And to be completely nullified before the speaker means that I'm only immersed in what they say. I have no interest in anything else. Absolutely no interest in anything else, especially not in what I think. I have to be a sponge. I have to be completely ready to receive. So there is an emptying of the mind, but that's not how you learn. Emptying the mind is to be able to grasp the concept, and afterwards you have to base it on critical thought. You do have critical thought afterwards. You have to say, so does this make sense to me? Okay. What people don't know, and this is the caveat that I was talking about by Rav Ginsburg, for instance, that once you've understood, there's a question of, should you go with this understanding now forever? Let's say you understood a passage of Talmud. You said, this is what it means. If you only want to understand what the Talmud said, then you're finished. You emptied yourself and became a vessel to hear what the Talmud has to say. You understood it. You thought about it critically. You've framed an understanding of this passage. You understand what it says. And you're done. Let's move on to the next passage. But if you want to be mechadish, if you want to say something new about this, if you want to get to a new level of understanding, it might not be something new, maybe somebody else already said this before you, but you want to be able to say a new thing that you haven't been able to critically think of. There's another stage of nullification that you have to go through. And this the Rebbeim did all the time. This is from the Rebbeim. This is where he says this. That to be mechadish, you have to be able to nullify your understanding. Meaning after you framed your understanding, you have to be willing to let it go. The Baal Shem Tov taught this about Hashem. He said, you can't say, we can't understand Hashem, and therefore I am pater, I am free from trying to create a relationship. You can't hide behind God is infinite in order to say, since He's infinite, I have no way of relating to Him, because I don't know how to relate to the infinite. In other words, you can't say, because God is infinite, He's not in the details. Because God is infinite, He's beyond everything I experience, He's not in anything I experience.
Yeah, but God is not only infinite, He's also finite.
Said it. So he said you have to relate to Him, even though He's infinite. So what does that mean? You have to create a finite relationship, says the Baal Shem Tov, but that becomes idolatry. He says, no. You do that, and then you cast it away. And then you empty it. You purge yourself of that understanding. He says, life is a constant movement between I understand God and I don't understand God. Because those are the two sides of God, if you want. There are many more sides also, but those are the two major sides that lead to progress. If you don't do that, then you have no progress in your relationship with Hashem. You have to be willing to say, I know this, and then the next moment to say, but I don't know this either. And then find something new. So he says, particularly when you're learning Torah, that stage of emptying, of purging yourself of your initial understanding is essential for being able to come to a new understanding, to a novel understanding that you haven't had yet. And that's v'nesha bagai mul beit pe'ol. That's the nullification that you need to have. It's the opposite of pe'ol, because by pe'ol it was an act of idolatry. But here you're also purging yourself, but you're purging yourself in the positive sense, that I can't understand Hashem. Really, I don't want to get into pe'ol, but psychologically pe'ol has a very similar, it's the le'umatzeh, it's the other side, right? Everything that's in holiness you also have in idolatry. So by pe'ol, that's what they symbolized. The pe'or symbolized this purging of the body, but it was the body. It was something completely different. What was it saying? It was saying that basically people would say, I on this world. That's what it was saying. God, you created this world, this is what I care about it. This is how much I care about it. Nothing to me. That's negative. Why? Because what do you mean? Why? Hashem created it for your benefit. How can you say that? But if the thing I'm purging is my understanding, because Hashem, I know that you're infinite, and there is another higher level of understanding that I can come to if I'm willing to forego the understanding that I have at this moment. I'm willing to purge it.
Way for more godliness.
Right. Then that's progress.
As opposed to what's the word?
Deprecating.
Yeah.
Or in this case, defecating. So this is a very big deal. והנה קודם חורבן הבית הראשון של מקומות גבוהות היו יכולים להגיע לבבת על ידי התבוננות לבד. He says, in the first temple, the souls were much higher. So all they needed was hisbonenus. Hashem is one. Shema Yisrael. And they immediately came to V'ahavta. There was no pasuk in the middle. Right? Because Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto Le'olam V'ed, we say in the middle, that Chazal added in the second temple period. It wasn't there in the first temple period. What does this mean? It means that they could directly translate the experience of God is one, as we said, Hashem Echad, we said that's the creation of the heavens and earth, right? Because the Echad, that's what it symbolizes, that's what it talks about, that God descends, as it were, through the seven firmaments and into the earth and into all four corners. That's the word Echad. So they could come from that directly into loving God. But says the Alter Rebbe, by us this doesn't work. After the second temple, after the first temple was destroyed, אינו יכול להגיע ל"ואהבת" על ידי ברור שם כבוד מלכותו לעולם ועד, שהוא קבלת עול מלכות שמיים. You have to have this intermediate stage between meditating on the fact that Hashem is everything. You have to have this intermediate stage that says everything is Hashem. You can't just continue. And what is it? What is that everything is Hashem? He says that's Kabbalah soul. That's receiving the yoke of heaven. What is the yoke of heaven here? What kind of a yoke is this? So he says like this. וזה מתורת הקושיה דילי. למה אין כל אחד מגיע לבחינת ואהבת? So now we can understand from this why not every person who says Shema immediately is filled with a warm, fuzzy feeling of loving God. Why not? כי כדי להגיע עכשיו לבחינת ואהבת צריך להיות על ידי קבלת עול מלכות שמיים, שזהו עניין ברוך שם כבוד מלכותו לעולם ועד, שהצריכו לומר קודם ואהבת. What does it mean? והיינו עניין להקף יסית רעך, דהיינו בטל רצונך, ביטול הרצון הגשמי שהוא בחינת עבודה וקבלת עול מלכותו יתברך. He says, really, you have to nullify the Kabbalah soul, the receiving the yoke of heaven, means nullifying your will. What does it mean to nullify your will? I'll say in a second, but right away you understand that it's not enough to just meditate, it's not enough to just have in mind that Hashem fills the entire world. There has to be an extra process here. What does it mean that Hashem fills the entire world? It means that He also fills my heart. Meaning, if I really understand that, so Hashem is also in me. So he's saying here that that's not enough. It's not, echad is not enough. Just to say that Hashem is in the world, including inside me, is not enough. Why? Because I have a will. I have a separate will. And that separate will is preventing Hashem's presence to be felt in me, even though He is in me. דאין מלך בלא עם, לשון הממות, שהוא יש ודבר, ואף על פי כן מבטל רצונו מכל וכול, בכל דבר שאינו ביטול הרצון, אינו נקרא עבודה כלל. He says, why is there something separate? Because that's how the world was created. That there had to be a separate will from Hashem's, otherwise he wouldn't be a king. He wouldn't be called sovereign. He has to be sovereign over something that has independence. That's why he's sovereign, otherwise it's just a robot, it doesn't mean anything. I'm not sovereign over my computer. I just own it. But he wants to be a sovereign. He wants his will to be heard. So there has to be an opposite will. The opposite will is my will. So for him to be the sovereign now, I have to nullify my will. וביטול רצון הוא היינו כפשוטו. לעשות הפך מה שהלב חומד, הן מבחינת צומרה, הן מבחינת עשה טוב. So even though we just said that Hashem fills my heart, I need to know that even though He fills it, what I experience in my heart initially is not Hashem. It's my will that I experience. And so I have to nullify my will, both in refraining from evil, from the bad, and in doing the good. So this is like saying, we're not talking here about a understanding that we need to nullify in order to come to a higher understanding. Here we're talking about a will that we need to nullify in order to come to a higher will. So again, the picture that I painted before was that when you're learning, you have this first understanding, and you have to nullify it to come to the higher understanding. The same thing is true in the heart. That you have an initial will, but then you suddenly realize, wait a minute, this is not Hashem's will, this is mine. Even if you think that you got it from Torah, it's still yours. And you have to nullify it. You have to act to nullify it. And when you act to nullify it, then Hashem's will appears. But the truth is that this is a cycle. It repeats. Because at the moment, after a little while, what you thought you did because the Torah told you to do, you begin to do because you want to do. And so once again, you have to nullify it. And once again, you have to come to a higher state of will. The higher will than your own. בסור מרע וקדש את עצמך במותר לך ובחינת נדר. ואיש כי ידו נדר להשם נדרים סייג לפרישות, מביא לידי קדושה, ובחינת אהבה רבה בכל לבביך. When we're talking about refraining from evil, how does a person refrain from doing evil? Very easy. He makes a neder, he makes a vow. Right? That's how you translate neder. Usually, I guess, a neder is a vow and a shvua is an oath.
That's not the only way.
What?
That's not the only way.
That's the main way. That's the derech hamelech. By the way, did you notice the clock?
Oh, wow. Wonder what was going on.
Yeah, something wrong. Huh? The derech hamelech in the Torah, and this is what we just learned in this week's Torah, in V'etchanan. Uvishmo tishaveh. And says Rashi there that we're talking about nedarim. When a person wanted to do something, he made a vow, an oath, a shvua. I make an oath that I will bring this animal as a sacrifice. I make an oath that I will learn 2,000 pages of Talmud. I make an oath that and so on. That was the positive side of it. And the neder was used to make sure that I would refrain from doing something that I'm not supposed to do. I make a neder not to touch any gluten, okay? Which is a siag for me for not eating, I don't know, tevel, whatever. Okay. strange idea that came to my mind now. But you get the idea. I'm not going to touch, the neder is I'm not going to touch any meat. Why? Because there's a lot of unkosher or not so kosher or questionably kosher meat in the stores now. So I make a neder for next month, I'm not going to touch meat. That's how people used to do it. We don't do it this way because we say blo neder. We'll see in a moment what he has to say about this. But in the time of the first and second temples, somewhere into the middle, into the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, I don't know when they stopped. That's how a person coped with their will. That was called Kabbalah Soul. Mm-hmm. Kabbalah Soul meant you make shvuot, you make oaths in order to ensure that you do something good, and you make nedarim, you take vows in order to ensure that you refrain from something that you're not supposed to do.
Rashi says you're not really supposed to do it.
Rashi already in the 11th century, it's already forbidden. What happened? So he says because we're not holy enough, or we're not serious enough. One would say we're not serious enough to really fulfill what we took a vow or an oath to do or not to do, and in that way we're taking God's name in vain. But really, the only problem is involving God in it. Maybe just say, I have a neder. At some point, even that became forbidden. Because even that, we're so unserious that even if we say something, the next minute we break it. So then we're hurting ourselves already. Even though we're not mentioning God's name, we're not taking God's name in vain. We're breaking our own word. What they saw was that the person became untrue to themselves. That if you make these vows all the time and you take these oaths and you don't follow through, then eventually you lose any credibility in your own eyes. And you don't treat yourself seriously. So at some point they said, better not to make any vows at all. Just forget about it. So how do you motivate yourself? So how can you motivate yourself? This is a big question. But until somewhere in the, I don't know, somewhere like, I think 1100, 1200, 1300, people were still making vows even though they weren't using God's name. I don't know when the exact date was when they stopped. When it became like that's also forbidden. Now today, everything you say, you have to say bli neder. Why? Because otherwise you lose credibility in your own eyes very quickly. You become SpongeBob. You become
I have a lot to say about that, but I'll tell you tomorrow.
Okay.
Tomorrow?
Is that you? Yeah.
No, Australia.
Not yet.
What time are you flying?